stakeholders across the food system, as well as trial this framework on the ground throughout 2024. We plan to publish a tested version of the outcomes framework at the end of next year. So today we're jointly going to highlight how the framework is intended to build an evidence base that makes clear what can be measured at farm and landscape level and captures deep environmental, social, and economic outcomes. We're also going to explore how the framework can act as a blueprint for existing frameworks, especially those focused on corporate reporting, to guide them as to how metrics can evolve to ensure all actors equally prioritize people's livelihoods, economic growth, and the climate, and shift from shallow to deep regeneration. Following the panel, we will be opening for audience Q&A, so prepare your questions and you can ask them in the chat if you're joining us online. I am delighted to welcome our keynote speaker now, Roy Steiner. Roy is the Senior Vice President of the Food Initiative of the Rockefeller Foundation and brings his expert insight on regenerative food systems. Roy.
Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to be among friends and people who are really concerned about the future of food systems. You know, I was at dinner last night and I was sharing with friends there that my son, 21-year-old son, called up and we were having a conversation and he said, you know, Dad, what are you doing with 80,000 people there? What exactly is going on? And I could tell there's a lot of skepticism in his voice. And I said, you know, the reality is that almost every important problem facing humanity right now is a collective action problem. We need to be able to collaborate, and humanity isn't very good at collaborating. And in order for us to solve any of these things, we've got to get better at it. And COP is an example of a place that we're, you know, it's flawed in so many ways, but it is vitally important. And I think because without a common vision, without common definitions, we often get scattered and our efforts get minimized. So I'm very excited by Regen 10 because it's trying to address that common vision, the common language problem, for a system that as we all know, is actually value destroying. And it's a system that's the problem, not necessarily individuals within it. And so we all know all the statistics, 1/3 of greenhouse gases come from the food systems, etc. But what that means is that we have to think about transformation, and we have to do it quicker than usual. That it can't be business as usual, and this requires more urgency than in many cases we have had in the past. I think as we go forward, you know, the challenge with regenerative agriculture, and I've heard that word many, many times at COP, is that currently everybody defines it slightly differently. And the problem when everybody defines things differently, it begins to lose meaning and very easily can be used for greenwashing. And we don't want that. We want a food system that can be that is really undergoing this journey to transformation, so that it is actually making things better for the soil, for farmers, for communities, and we believe that that's going to require us to really look at our principles and our values, draw from indigenous and holistic ways of looking at the world, and that has to be reflected in any outcome framework that we bring to the table. As mentioned by Dara, that the Regen 10 is an outcome framework, and we specifically did that because the reality of agriculture and food systems is they're incredibly diverse. There's a lot of nuance, but I think we can agree on core principles and we can agree on outcomes. And the more people agree on that, the more likely we're going to create the transformation that we need. This is really just a first step. As mentioned, this is going to be part of a process. We're not claiming this is a perfect endpoint. And we also recognize that as a consensus document, it's going to require us to do a lot of consultation. But already I think it's going to it is starting to unleash creativity. It will release, I think, financing in ways that we haven't had before. I think the regenerative agriculture movement is a powerful movement. We need to make it real, and we need to make it something that that our children will be proud of when they look back. And I can talk to my 21-year-old son and say, yeah, we were really doing something real. So with that, I will pass it on to our moderator. Thanks.
Now I'm really pleased to welcome our panelists onto the stage. Please come over and have a seat as I call you up. So Morgan Gillespie is the Executive Director of the Food and Land Use Coalition. Mary Robinson is Vice President of the World... Morgan, maybe you want to sit down on this side? Thanks. Mary Robinson is the Vice President of the World Farmers Organization and a managing partner of her 6th generation family farm and agribusiness in Prince Edward Island in Canada. Patrick Kuyokwa, please, is a co-founder and CEO of AgriCenter in Malawi. AgriCenter promotes eco-friendly agriculture by educating, training, and empowering the next generation of farmers in Malawi. Sada Omi is the president of the Territorial Women Leaders of the Mesoamerican Alliance of Peoples and Forests, and president of Women's Coordination in the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. Thank you. And Sada is accompanied by Gloria, who will be helping us with translation. Emmeline Felus is the Director of Food and Agriculture at the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. So thank you all for joining us today, generously sharing your expertise and your time in a very, very busy day for us all. Regen 10 has been formed, of course, to build an ambitious multi-stakeholder effort that learns from the collective experience of all actors in the global food system to understand the potential of regenerative and agroecological approaches. So this is why we're not doing this on our own, and we're doing this as a multi-stakeholder collaboration. So I'll start with you, Morgan, sitting right next to me. Morgan, the Food and Land Use Coalition and other Regen 10 partners have been working on the Zero Draft Outcomes Framework that we're introducing today. Tell us a bit more about what the framework is and what it's intended to achieve.
Yeah. All right, guys, it's so exciting to see such a packed room on like the last day of COP when everyone's kind of like been running around for weeks and weeks. We have some slides to share. If you could go ahead and move to the next one, great. So you've heard a lot from Tara and Roy already about this outcomes-based framework. So I want to kind of highlight a few different things. We have developed the Zero Draft farmer-centric outcomes-based framework that will be consulted on and dialogued over the next 12 months. Now, what's different about this, you might ask? Well, firstly, it's holistic. We've spent a lot of time and energy and focus to make sure that this framework really highlights the socio-cultural dimensions of deep regeneration in addition to the environmental elements. And that's something new and different and unique. That's something that we don't believe any of the other frameworks have yet to deliver. This framework also aims to deliver primary data collection with farmers, for farmers, on behalf of farmers, in support of farmers, so that farmers can own the data, so that they can make the choice as to how to share that data with other stakeholders. We want this to be outcomes-based. There's been a lot of debate over the last few years about regenerative agriculture, agroecology, climate-smart agriculture, organic farming, et cetera, et cetera. What we're trying to do here is to co-create a shared vision of a transformative future and agree on the outcomes, the environmental outcomes, the economic outcomes, the livelihood outcomes, the socio-cultural outcomes that we as a community all agree on. And through this framework, through this focus on outcomes, be able to identify the practices that are best able to deliver those in the appropriate context. Next slide, please. So what have we done to get here? You heard Tara say it already. We started off with an analysis of 158 different frameworks. And we did that to kind of validate the need that the world actually needed one more framework. We are well aware that there's a lot out there, 158 of them. But this analysis found a number of really interesting things. Firstly, there were a lot of frameworks that looked at both outcomes and proxies and mixed them up together, right? And it wasn't clear what the primary purpose was. Secondly, the majority of frameworks didn't specify what type of data needed to be collected, whether it was primary data, right, which is what we're going towards, versus modeled data. And that has significantly different outcomes in the future. Many of the frameworks, interestingly, once they collected the data wasn't freely available. They were behind paywalls, which is not entirely helpful when we're trying to generate an evidence base to understand which practices can deliver on different outcomes. And from these sort of key findings, we're like, okay, well, and the last one is that most of the frameworks were actually corporate-led or developed for corporates, for large multinational corporations. So from this analysis, we kind of confirm the hypothesis. Okay, no, there is actually a need in the world today for a farmer-centric, outcomes-based framework collecting primary data at farm level and eventually at landscape level with landscape stewards, right? So that we can understand how to achieve the outcomes we need. Next slide, please. Now, from this assessment, 158 assessment, we kind of did a deep dive into 18 of the frameworks that were most closely aligned with our future vision. And there was only one out of the 158 that was close, and that was the Sustainable Foods Trust Global Farm tool. So we used that as a starting off point, and as Tara kind of mentioned, didn't just do sort of a gap assessment, but used it as a framework, as a model to say, okay, what do we need to add to this to get to where we want to go? Now, what is this framework going to be used, or how do we envision it being used? This framework is primarily used to empower farmers and landscape stewards through the collection of primary data, right? As I said, and I'm going to repeat it because it's so important, we want the farmers to own this data. And we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next 12 months to understand data rights, IP rights, data collection, technical ways to collect the data, so that we can protect the farmers once they have this data in their hands. Now, once the farmers have this data, they're like, oh, okay, what are we going to do with it? Well, we think they're going to be able to use it in 3 primary ways. One, they'll be able to understand how their own practices are affecting their own farms. 2, they'll be able to choose to share this data through the value chain, through the companies that are purchasing their commodities, giving the companies the information they need to validate the corporate claims as to if they're regenerative or not. 3, they'll be able to use this data to form the evidence base to advocate for changes in policy at national, at regional, perhaps at international level, to create a more enabling policy environment for the farmers themselves. And I'm sure there's going to be a multitude of other ways that they'll figure out how to use this data, but this is kind of the primary hypothesis that we've had thus far. And I'm running out of time, so quickly, next slide, please. Now, as we've sort of said, this is a 0 draft, and I've had a few journalists actually ask me, what is a 0 draft? It's a 0 draft because thus far, and we'll be very transparent about it, this has been an analytical exercise. This has been a group of us sitting in the room using the best available science, knowledge, information from a wide group of stakeholders to build this framework. Now we have to test it in the ground. We have to test it in the real world. We have to test it with farmers. So over the next 12 months, we'll be testing the framework with farmers to understand the usability, the feasibility, and the affordability of these outcomes, of these indicators, and of these metrics. And we are very humble in our approach. We could have gotten it completely wrong. And when we come back at COP29 with a new version of the framework based off of this 12-month consultation, it could look very different than what you see today. And we're comfortable with that. We hope you all will be comfortable with that too. The final thing that we hope that we'll get from this consultation and these dialogues with Indigenous peoples and others is a progression pathway. The framework that we've built is the gold standard. It is comprehensive, it is holistic, it is everything. We don't expect anybody to be able to report against all of these indicators and metrics today. What we do want to understand from the consultation, learning from the farmers, is what could be collected this year? What can they do already? What would be a reasonable time to add to that? And then how do we get to all of the outcomes, all of the indicators, all of the metrics in time? Because we believe you'll have to move on all of the outcomes at farm level and at landscape level to meet this deeply regenerative food system that we're trying to build. So I'll stop there. I'm sure I'm over time. I have been all week. And see.
Got the QR code up there. for you to have a look at the framework and tell us what you think. Thank you, Morgan. With farmers, for farmers. Love that. Next, Mary. Mary, you're on the board of the World Farmers Organization, which is, of course, a Regen 10 partner. And WFO represents 79 national farmer organizations around the world, as you know, but I'm sharing with the room here. Farmers such as your members are on the front line of climate change and all its impacts, and are key partners in climate change mitigation and adaptation. How can this outcomes framework be useful to them?
Thank you, Tara. Be un-Canadian of me, but I'm going to first start off by correcting you. I'm happy to say that being farmers, we like to grow, and I'm happy to say that we now represent 80 member organizations. So it's always gratifying to have new members come to the table, and it's wonderful to see the voice of WFO continue to be strengthened with increased membership. So as we look in particular here at COP28, it's wonderful to see an organized farm voice because that's our mandate. And before getting to your question, I would like to take a step back and revisit why WFO became a Regen 10 partner to start with. The WFO joined Regen 10 to ensure farmers' needs and solutions are integrated into all initiatives with a true bottom-up, science-backed, and outcome-oriented approach. Joining Regen 10 was really just a natural progression of the many years of work WFO has done in this regard. In other words, the WFO strives to ensure that the transition in agriculture and food systems is truly farmer-centric. That is, farmers have direct input in designing, developing, and implementing the outcomes framework previously described by Morgan. Now, getting to your question, how can this framework be useful to farmers? Once finalized, the framework will be a tool for farmers to track their own actions and progress to ensure their positive contributions are acknowledged and recognized. Interestingly, throughout the development and use of the framework, farmers will continue through their contributions to shaping the definition and future applications of regenerative agriculture. A highly participatory approach to the development of the outcomes framework may also contribute to build a better narrative around regenerative agriculture, a term that still triggers some skepticism among many farmers. This skepticism stems from the fact that regenerative agriculture had previously been linked to very prescriptive approaches. For example, a list of regenerative practices developed by actors outside of agriculture and imposed on farmers. The WFO expects that the outcomes framework will help shift the paradigm, providing farmers with opportunities to identify the best combination of innovation and practices to employ in the pursuit of regenerative outcomes. It should also promote greater cooperation and more fair and transparent distribution of power and responsibilities across the value chain. Of course, for farmers to start implementing the framework, they should have access to sufficient and additional financial resources in a way to secure economic sustainability for their families and communities. The framework will also require a significant investment in extension services and training opportunities for the farmers to improve their technical knowledge and adaptability skills.
Thanks so much. And I think some of the key things I picked up from there, of course, farmer-centric, and we're repeating that over and over again because it is so central. Evidence-based, you mentioned empowering farmers, and of course having fairer distribution of power, which is critical to the equitous transition that we're trying to support. Patrick, over to you. Now I want to ask you about how this framework can potentially serve smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. Smallholder farmers are fundamental to the economy of the region, of course, where more than 60% of the population are smallholder farmers and making up around 2/3 of the labor force. So you obviously have experience working in Malawi, where your organization helps farmers transition their household farms into commercial enterprises. So is a framework like this a helpful tool for farmers that you work with? And what are some of the practical challenges and opportunities related to adopting this framework? Is there another
Thanks, Tara. My name is Patrick Kuyokwa, and I'm a farmer. I'm even part of the WFO. I was in the gymnasium in the past cohort. As a farmer, I work with other farmers. So we have an anchor farm that supports other farmers. We're into production of bananas, and we also keep livestock. As a farm, we practice these regenerative principles that we're talking about here. So we practice crop rotation, we're into composting, and we even practice zero tillage, which is a form of conservation agriculture. What this framework means for me as a farmer is that it's not only farmer-centric, but it will be farmer-ready because farmers will be feeding into the framework. What that means for farmers, specifically smallholder farmers, is that now they have a voice. They have a voice on what principles actually work for them. So for farmers to actually have a voice on principles that work for them means that they can feed into a system and then give the required feedback. That required feedback will not only help with their visibility, but also it will help in terms of utilization of indigenous knowledge. Because I think at times as corporates, as organizations, we impose some of these principles or practices on farmers when farmers actually know best what works in their particular environment and know best what actually works for them on their farm. So I think having a farmer-led and a farmer-centric framework will build on that and will actually help in terms of supporting farmers to actually have a voice in terms of all the processes that actually go through. Secondary to that, having outcomes that can actually be measured and data just on the impact of the actions will not only help the farmer, but also improve in terms of adoption. So it's easy for someone to adopt an initiative after looking at the impact of your initiative. And that's one thing that we actually struggle with because most times we share these principles and we just say this is how good it is, but there is no actual data on the impact of that particular initiative. So having that data will not only support the people that utilize it, but even fellow farmers, because it's an initiative that we want all the farmers to adopt. The standardization of this whole process, trying to put a central approach to it, will actually bring sanity around regenerative agriculture, because most times we've been talking about regenerative agriculture, but we were so scattered in our ways. So having this standard will actually help to put some sanity to most of our ways. And I like the point that you shared around the value chain. Sometimes when we talk about sustainability, we talk about regenerative agriculture, we talk about all the practices that are looking into the future, we leave out profitability. So having outcomes that can actually be measured and you have the data that you can actually negotiate across the value chain, that this is the value that I'm bringing, this is the impact of the products that I'm actually doing and the practices that I'm doing on the farm. So that will actually help us as farmers negotiate for higher value across the value chain. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Patrick. Maybe I'll save my summing up for the end. It's probably a better idea, a better use of the time. So I'll keep going along the panel. Actually, the next is for Saras. Sara, let me turn to you. So the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, as I understand it, represents, and please correct me if I've got my numbers wrong, 35 million people living in forest territories from 24 countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and defending over 958 million hectares of land. Collectively, you've been championing 5 demands. Can you tell us a bit more about these demands? And also, do you see a role for this type of framework to contribute towards advancing your demands and overcoming historic injustices within the food system?
Buenas tardes, gracias Tara por la pregunta y bueno, los datos justamente nacen de la iniciativa de la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales porque para nosotros exigir, reclamar derecho es también contar con datos verídicos que nos permitan también avanzar y poder seguir dialogando sobre nuestros derechos dentro de este contexto. Y como bien lo comentaba, la Alianza Global de Comunidades Territoriales se unen con 5 grandes organizaciones y en estas 5 grandes organizaciones es donde se encuentran los últimos bosques del planeta.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the great question. So indeed, this data comes from the initiative of the Global Alliance of Territorial Community. And this is because we understood that if we want to make a demand, if we want to claim our rights, the first thing we need is real data. We need this real data to keep discussing the rights. And that's why all these 5 organizations of the Global Alliance came together in order to defend the last big forests of the planet.
Y esos 5 principios que nos unen es justamente cuando hablamos de cómo vamos a buscar el equilibrio y el respeto a nuestra madre tierra. Primero, cuando hablamos de poder mitigar los efectos del cambio climático, los pueblos indígenas necesitamos acceso al derecho territorial de nuestras comunidades.
And these 5 principles that we also have in the Global Alliance are very important for us because they guide the way in which we are going to balance this fight, in which we want to get the proper respect for Mother Earth. And this way we can get the mitigation of climate change. And for that, the most important starting point will be to protect the land tenure of our territory, to protect our land rights.
2, se necesita que se respete el derecho a la consulta, al consentimiento libre, previo, informado de nuestros pueblos para que se puedan garantizar los derechos primordiales para nuestros pueblos. Y tercero, también porque nos une una gran problemática que es la no criminalización de líderes y lideresas que defienden la vida, que defienden la tierra y que buscan el equilibrio con nuestra madre tierra.
And then in second place, we also defend the right to consultation. This is very important to defend the right to free, prior, informed consent to the peoples that live in the territories when these territories want to be used. And this is the best guarantee for the right of our peoples. And then also we have a third demand, that is to stop the criminalization of our leaders, the leaders that are defending the Mother Earth.
Y 4 es el acceso al financiamiento que durante las últimas COP sobre cambio climático se ha venido debatiendo y también desde la Alianza Global hemos podido también buscar nuestros propios datos y los datos indican que un porcentaje mínimo está llegando hacia nuestros territorios, hacia los guardianes del bosque, hacia a los pueblos indígenas que buscan y que siempre han aportado a la mitigación y adaptación del cambio climático. Y en esta oportunidad también necesitamos que el acceso al financiamiento también lleguen a las mujeres y a los jóvenes. Es muy importante.
Our fourth demand, that is one of our main demands and one of our main lines of work, is climate finance, to be able to have access to climate finance. That's something that we've been debating and discussing in the last few COPs. And it's very important for the GATC, so we've also made some research to get our own data. And this data has proved that there's only a really minimum percentage of fundings going to our territories in the way of direct finance. And that means that a minimum percentage, a minimum rate of money that is going to our territory, to our indigenous peoples and local communities, to our guardians that are fighting for years for the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. And in that way, it's also very important to make sure that women and youth from indigenous peoples and local communities will also get direct access to climate finance.
Espero que Gloria pueda hacer la interpretación. Quiero abarcar todos los puntos, porque cuando hablamos de acceso a financiamiento, no es que los pueblos indígenas estamos ansiosos porque llegue el dinero a nuestro territorio. No queremos monetizar nuestros territorios, nuestros conocimientos, pero sí necesitamos a que se garanticen las luchas y defensas de nuestros pueblos y de los conocimientos tradicionales.
So I hope Gloria will be able to get it right. So in this way, it's very important, as we were saying, to get direct access to finance. But that doesn't mean that we are thinking about money. It doesn't mean that we're trying to monetize our territories. This is not about monetization. This is about having the guarantee that our fight to protect the territories and to protect our ancestral knowledge is going to be supported. So this fight is going to be real.
Y el otro principio que nos une también y también muy importante es el respeto a que se reconozca los conocimientos tradicionales de los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales como soluciones de buenas prácticas ante los efectos del cambio climático. Y aquí, en cuanto al marco del resultado, sí es importante para nosotros como Alianza Global de buscar también una participación plena y efectiva de que nuestros conocimientos, de que nuestras prácticas, de que el trabajo que realizamos las mujeres como conocedoras, como transmisora de los conocimientos tradicionales, es importante que también estemos vinculadas en este marco de trabajo. Sé que es un proceso largo y lo que buscamos es justamente que la visión de los pueblos indígenas esté contemplada en este marco cero, borrador, pero que también a la vez invitamos a que más personas se puedan unir a trabajar de manera en conjunta y que podamos buscar la solución y el equilibrio que necesita nuestra madre tierra con una agricultura sostenible y que respete sobre todo los recursos naturales.
And then this is also very important, one of our principles. This principle is linked to traditional knowledge. The traditional knowledge that indigenous peoples and local communities hold, because this generates good practices, and these good practices are a big solution of climate change. So in this framework that we are announcing today, it's very important for us as indigenous peoples to have full and effective participation in this process. That's something that makes us very happy, because we don't have to forget that women as well are holders and transmitters of this traditional knowledge that we are going also to be able to reflect in this draft zero. And this draft zero will be able to reflect indigenous people's vision. And this, at the end, will be a framework for everyone to get new food systems, get new regenerative agriculture, and to build together a better future for the Mother Earth.
Muchas gracias. Me gustaría seguir contándole más, pero sé que el tiempo es limitado. Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. I would like to keep talking about this, but I know time is limited, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Passing along to Emily now. Emmeline, your organization, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, represents nearly, again, check me on my numbers, but 250 corporate members, and is, of course, a Regen 10 partner. How do you see this framework contributing towards corporate behavior change and shifts towards regenerative food systems? And how does WBCSD intend to advance this?
Thank you. Not easy to speak after those two amazing speakers who are the practitioners and really doing the work. Thank you for your interventions. So I represent 250 companies, you're right. More specifically, 70 that work in agriculture and food. And the reason why we are supporters of Regen 10 is that we know that the lack of alignment on metrics across the stakeholders, be them, farmers, the corporates, the financial sectors, is one of the main blockers to really scaling up. So there is no definition for regenerative agriculture. What you guys are doing, which is very, very lengthy process, is so critical to come to an agreement on the main outcomes. I'm not sure if everybody knows what we mean by outcomes versus practices. But the idea is to say we need to agree that there are a few goals for regenerative agriculture, whether it's soil health, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, but also farmer livelihoods. These are really some of the key goals. And indeed, there are so many ways to farm in order to achieve those goals. So getting to an agreement on that and making sure that thereafter everybody is aligned across the value chain on what are the goals we are all aiming for is extremely critical. So that's why we really support. We also know in WBCSD that we believe that accountability afterwards, so once you have agreed to metrics, you can have accountability for what you're doing. And that is going to be very critical to change the way the businesses are actually practicing. So once you agree on the outcomes that you are after, then you can really think about what are the risks, what are the innovations that you need to put into place, what are the strategy changes that you need to put into place as well. And last but not least, this effort is farmer-centric, and that, to my knowledge, this never existed before. So it's been very needed. I personally have been working in sustainable agriculture for almost 25 years. It's always been with companies who always say that they want to put farmers at the center, but actually the farmers are rarely at the center and at the table. So this is really changing the game. And what we try to do thereafter is to say, once there will be this agreement from and by the farmers, then we will see how we can the most possible align with what the corporates are able to implement.
Excellent, thank you. I'm running out of space on my page to take down some of these notes, so thank you, all of you. I think this is a moment maybe to hand over to the audience for questions for a few minutes, and then we can look to the next phase. I see several hands, if my colleagues...
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Anne Rietveld. I work for the Alliance of Biodiversity and CGIAR. You're talking a lot about this approach being farmer-centric, and I was wondering, well, and yet you're also talking about regenerative food systems. And what I've heard and what you've been saying, I've only heard about farming systems or farm system, and I'm wondering, where does the food system actually come in? And it also, I mean, of course, everyone agrees that the farmer should be at the center of these kind of approaches, but it also sounds a bit like, let's fix the farmer. And I didn't hear so much about other actors that are, of course, also important in the food system. So maybe you can say some more about that?
Yeah, oh gosh, thanks for that question. And I think, well, two sort of framing remarks. Food systems transformation is significant and a lot, right? And regenerative, scaling productive and regenerative farming is one of many, many, many solutions that needs place to transform the entire food system. This project is focusing on the regenerative element, and the work thus far has focused on the production side. this this network of networks that we're building is still relatively nascent. It's only a few years old. And the aim and ambition is to build a movement towards regeneration so that you start to get deeper into the system. That's piece one. Piece two is the framework as it stands today works at two levels. One is farm level, where we have developed a particular set of outcomes, indicators, and metrics. And then second is at landscape level. So there's a secondary series of outcomes, indicators, and metrics at the landscape level. In practice, how we see this working, or how we envision this working, is that farmers collect the primary data at farm level, and then you have different actors at landscape level who will add to that farm level data to understand the outcomes at the landscape that the farm level is contributing to. And we've been partnering with 1,000 Landscapes, I can see Sarah in front of me, Common Lands and others, because there's been lots and lots of work for decades on landscape level approaches, and we want to dock into that, not duplicate that. From the landscape level, we kind of make this jump to global, and that's kind of where the WBCSD piece comes in, because we want to make sure that we're contributing to global goals. 1.5 degrees, of course, the SDGs, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the corporates are the ones that are right now reporting at that global level. And so in time, we're hoping that at these different levels, farm level, landscape level, global level, will start to drive the transformation of the food system, but still recognizing that regenerative productive agriculture is one of many levers that we need to pull to transform the entire food system. Does anyone else want to?
May I go? Thank you. My name is Francisco Rosado Maya from the Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo. I'm professor there and associated with the Indigenous Partnership as well. I see a lot of work, and I congratulate you for all these progresses in Region 10. And I also see many coincidences with the agroecology thinking. I think there is some coincidences, especially with the 13 principles and the 10 elements that FAO has set for agroecology. And that's a really good step forward to unite efforts. But in the same context, think we should think about the use of regenerative food systems now that FAO is using agri-food systems. And the argument that they say is that if we focus only on food systems, we leave behind many other crops that are also causing problems to the environment, like cotton. So it's not only food systems. As an indigenous person, as a researcher on indigenous food systems, I like food systems because we do not grow fiber separated to our food systems. But we have to think of other systems as well, not only the indigenous people's food systems. And in that regards, there will be no time, but I would like to have both my university and the Indigenous Partnership to contribute to some ideas, especially with the metrics on how to gather data in indigenous food systems and to think about the subsystems that indigenous peoples know as their system of food. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for that intervention, really. I don't know if anyone on the panel has any responses, but certainly we would love to hear more from you after this, so we'd love to connect.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sajeev. I'm from Fair Initiative, and we were glad to be on the working group for the Region 10 framework. Am I right in understanding that this framework will inform the Regenerative Landscapes Initiative? Okay, and also I come from an investor network, so I'm curious, what message should I take back to my investor members in terms of private financing for some of these practices?
Are you answering? You can know, Emily. Do you want Emily's answer? I don't mind. Sure.
Yes, so Sajeev, what you were talking about is the Regenerative Landscapes Action Agenda that was launched earlier this week. That is a joint WBCSD, COP28, Climate Champions, and BCG effort. The aim of that is to provide a mapping of all of the efforts that happen in the world around regenerative agriculture, so as to try and generate finance for the transition. That's what you're talking about. And so in that sense, we absolutely look to the guidance from Region 10 in terms of what are the outcomes that we need to aim for. And it's extremely important because, as somebody was saying in the previous panel, there is so many definitions all over the world of regenerative agriculture. It's important that we have the credibility whenever this is being used as to what it really delivers. When it comes to investors, I think that's what we were saying before. Having an agreement on these outcomes needs to be ultimately across all of the stakeholders, so that we can really align, indeed, the financing with, across the value chain all the way to the farmers, basically. So that's, my 2 pennies. I don't know if you want to add something.
Okay, thank you. My name is Janet Ngombalu from Christian Aid in Kenya. Because you said we were trying to define what regenerative agriculture is for the smallholder farmers in Kenya, I wanted to know how close are we to finding a definition? Have you gotten close? And because we haven't managed to see what the outcomes that are recommended in this, are we close to getting there, or do we have a definition from this COP? Thank you.
I was gonna say if we could put the QR code back up, and then maybe folks could try to download it. There is not a definition in this outcomes-based framework in the report that we published, and that is for very good reason. We want to go through this consultative process before we say with any clarity, this is what regeneration is. Our expectation is that the development of this framework and the consultation in accordance with the dialogues with Indigenous peoples will effectively co-create a clear definition of what regeneration is. That being said, we do have a number of working definitions, right? Because it's really hard to discuss something without it. And I think WBCSD has actually done a phenomenal job, particularly with their corporates, the 70 companies that they've been working with over the last 12 months, to sort of co-create a working definition of regeneration that is defined by the outcomes, environmental, economic, and sociocultural. And so that's been a really phenomenal example, I think, as to how this multi-stakeholder approach is enabling both deep consultation with farmers and Indigenous peoples, whilst also enabling corporates to move forward in a way that's matched, right?
Hello, thank you. Okay, my name is Adam Hingara, and then I'm an agroeconomist. I would like to ask you just two questions. And my first question is how the regenerative agriculture techniques can reach actually the farmer, like in third world country, especially like the people who's more affected by the land degradation, and then especially with like in the Sahel region. And the second question is about Region 10. Are you guys like what's your location exactly? Is it in worldwide or just in Africa, or we want to know the part where you guys the statistic come from? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the first part of the question where we're looking at what this represents for third world countries and most of the developing countries. We have sustainable practices that are usually encouraged for us to adopt around regenerative agriculture. So we're looking at soil and water conservation practices. We're looking at composting. We're looking at conservation agriculture and all those other practices. But if you can assess from where we stand in most of the sub-Saharan region and just most developing countries, there isn't a standard to say on how the practices are actually measured, on the impact. And I think it actually even affects the climate financing in this case, because we haven't really outlined how a metric to our outcomes of the impacts of the adoption of the various practices, as such that it becomes more of a preference by the farmer to adopt the practice without really looking at the impact of the practice that they intend to adopt. So I think having such a framework and the data that we can actually quantify or even use in terms of reporting will actually help us not only as farmers, but even the people that we work with across the value chain and even the various people that we report to. Thank you.
And then on your second, oh, where'd you go? On your second question, sorry. On your second question, Regen 10 right now is a global platform, right? So it's founded by 6 sort of global organizations, the World Farmers Organization, WBCSD, FOLU, IUCN, Leaders Quest, Systemic. But through that, we've already built additional relationships with Thousand Lands, with Common Lands, and we're starting to bring those relationships down to more regional levels, particularly by partnering with more farmers organizations. So the idea in time, you know, this is global, but we need to bring it down to the region, to the landscape, and to the farms. I failed to mention, you know, over the next 12 months when we're testing this, we're planning to test it between 12 and 15 different landscapes. And there's live conversations going on now as to where we should prioritize those landscapes. There's been a complementary effort by the philanthropists, and I might turn to Roy here, who have taken the last 12 months to co-create a theory of transformation to understand how they can align financing, philanthropic financing, to help scale regeneration globally. Some of the outcomes of that work are sort of pointing us towards certain geographic areas that we might want to prioritize. And so we're trying to, again, coordinate across philanthropists where we have interest from farmers organizations so that we can be very specific over the next 12 months. We can't be everywhere, of course, but we want to make progress quite quickly.
Thank you. I think one.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Carlo Fadda. I work also for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and SIAT. And I'm very much interested on this framework. I'm leading an initiative called Nature Positive Solution in 10 landscapes in 5 countries. And it aligns very much to what you are presenting. And I really like the approach, farmer-centric, building also on the indigenous knowledge, the traditional knowledge. And one question, and this is a challenge that I have, so maybe you have the answer to one of my challenges, because on the one hand, I fully embrace the idea of being outcome-based, because at the end, even in our initiative, we fully realize that you need to follow different pathways because there are different needs, so you cannot be prescriptive around what you do. But at the same time, it's difficult in a framework to capture what is unique in terms of the traditional knowledge that goes into there and how you measure it somehow, how you report. Because, of course, you can put it in a narrative report, but different if it is in a framework. And I was wondering if you have an answer to that.
I mean, the short answer, Carlos, is no, not yet. But that's also why we're going through this consultation and dialogue process. And that's also why when I kind of did the first bit, you know, this data provision, data collection, like where it sits, where it lives, who owns it, what does it look like, how do you validate it? Like that's a huge, huge question for us. What we are trying to address, however, is there's massive data gaps in academic literature, particularly from the Global South. And that was something that we at FOLU found maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. What our priority is to provide a way for farmers, regardless of the geographic location, to provide this primary data in a way that can be validated and used by academics so that we stop having these data deserts of critical geographic locations reaching sort of academia. That's like one of the, I think, another co-benefit of what this framework will provide.
All right, thank you. I think we're out of time for questions. Sorry, we'd love to take more, but maybe we can catch up after the session. I'm going to run through some quick points so that you remember what you've heard here. I'm going to highlight a few things that came up from our panelists. We heard about the framework from Morgan being consultative, evidence-based, with farmers, for farmers. From Mary, we heard about the need, of course, for farmer centricity, empowering farmers, talking about fair distribution of power. From Patrick, we saw the framework through your eyes as a way of voicing principles that work for farmers, both feeding in and getting feedback. Local knowledge, of course, being key. Being able to know the impact enables greater adoption of practices. So those were several things that came out from what you said. Structured approaches and the power to negotiate, I think, is so critical for farmers. From Sarah, we heard about rights-based dialogues, data being so critical to the conversation, free, prior, and informed consent in engaging in such dialogues, direct access to finance, not about monetizing indigenous peoples' territories in any way, but about respectful protection of indigenous rights and knowledge, and full and effective participation with women being central to that. From Emeline, we heard alignment being so key, alignment around what those outcomes should look like, accountability, especially as it relates to risks and strategies, and farmer centricity back again at the center. So through all of this, this is a journey of co-creation across all of us, all of you. So the call to action is really QR code, have a look at the framework, tell us what you think, share it with your networks. As we said, this is a year-long journey that we're on together, possibly longer, but for now, year-long, to really understand what this framework means beyond the academic exercise that's been conducted, what this means for your work and the work of your networks. I think that's all the time I have. So other than that, I have to thank you all for attending today. Thank you so much. Please, a round of applause for our amazing panelists. Thank you so much to everyone here, panelists. Muchas gracias a ustedes. And we will let you go on, but please do think about this framework and get back to us. And we'd like to catch up with those of you who didn't get a chance to ask questions. Please feel free to approach our panelists. Thanks, everyone.